Welcome back to another episode of the Chicana Therapist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Xochitl Alamillo. And before we start today, I just want to let you know that this episode might be a little heavier than our usual. We're going to be talking about the culture of silence around sexual abuse, and that might be triggering for some people, so I want to let you know beforehand. I'm not going to get graphic today. This isn't that kind of episode. What we're actually talking about is the silence itself, where it came from, what it was trying to protect us from, and what the cost is of that process. So if this is a heavy topic for you personally, please take care of yourself first. Pause if you need to, or skip, or come back when you're ready. That's okay. Anything that you need is priority. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the culture of silence around sexual abuse, and specifically why so many of our families had this rule growing up of we don't do sleepovers, no hacemos pijamadas, no te vas a estar quedando a dormir en otras casas, etc. So if this is something that you're interested in hearing about, quédate, stay with me. I think a lot of us had this rule in our house, including myself, and I don't think that we're ever actually told why. All right, so let's start with the rule. We don't do sleepovers. No hacemos pijamadas. If you grew up in a Latino household, chances are that you heard some version around this, and usually it wasn't explained, just stated, firm, non-negotiable. Again, I grew up in this type of household. Some of us got nothing. Some of us were just told no is no y ya, porque no. Porque yo dije, because I said so, or just no. But some of us got a little bit more than that. We got uno nunca sabe, we never know, or one never knows. And I want to sit in that phrase for just a second because I think it's interesting, because it sounds like an explanation. It has the shape of one, but it actually doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't name a person, it doesn't name a fear, it doesn't name an experience. It just kind of gestures at danger broadly, and it leaves you to fill in the rest yourself or not fill in it at all and just carry the caution without ever really understanding it. And it wasn't just sleepovers. A lot of us had a whole set of quiet rules like this, all kind of pointing in the same direction. No estés sola con los tíos, o no te metas allá con los hombres, without anyone saying exactly why, or maybe no going to certain houses, even family houses, without your parent present, or even being walked to the bathroom at parties, or not being allowed to sit on certain laps or hug certain people, and no one ever really told you why. These are all examples of what I've heard around this culture of protection and silence. At the time, a lot of us probably experienced these rules as strict, or that's just my parents being overprotective, or maybe some of us were even embarrassed. Like, why can't I just stay over like everyone else? Maybe other people were having sleepovers and you were the one getting picked up, that kind of thing. When we didn't always have the context, again, we just had that restriction. And if we were lucky, we would get a phrase like uno nunca sabe that stood in for the actual answer. I've heard some people say, no, porque ahí está el papá, están los tíos, están los hermanos. And I think we all kind of laugh about it, or we joke about it of, I don't do sleepovers, I'm Latino. But I just want to talk a little bit more today about where these rules came from, because they came from somewhere, or often from something. And usually it's a mother or an abuela or someone in the family line protecting the best way she knew how. And sometimes that wasn't with a conversation. Sometimes that was with a boundary. And sometimes not with an explanation, but with a rule. So the question isn't really like, why are my parents so strict? The real question is, what did my parents know or sense or survive that made that uno nunca sabe feel like the safest thing that they could say? So why silence? Why set a rule instead of having a conversation? Why this uno nunca sabe instead of actually naming the thing? I want to name some statistics because I think it explains a lot about why the rule exists in the first place. At least 1 in 4 girls, when we're talking about the United States, will experience child sexual abuse. 1 in 4. And I want you to think about that the next time that you're in a room with your girlfriends, with your primas, your sisters. Statistically, 1 out of every 4 women you know were abused as a child. And around 90% of that abuse is committed by someone that the child and the family already know and trust. So I know that we talk about stranger danger, which is very real, don't get me wrong, but 90% of the abuse on a child is not committed by a stranger in a van. It's not someone lurking outside of a school. It's not the señor that your mom threatened you with in la tienda. Of cases reported to law enforcement, and again, this is of cases reported, 34% of perpetrators are family members, and 59% are people that the child knew as an acquaintance. So like a family friend, a neighbor, someone already kind of inside the circle of trust. Again, these are statistics in the US, and they are the ones that were reported. So when you put all that together, the threat that our moms and our abuelitas were protecting us from was almost never that stranger, that desconocido. It was someone already in your life, which explains a lot about why the response was silence instead of having a conversation, because naming the actual risk would have meant naming someone you know. And I think that's a much harder thing to say out loud than we don't do sleepovers. So there's a few things that are stacked on top of each other that I'm going to tease apart. First is shame. Sexual abuse historically in a lot of our families wasn't something that got spoken about even when it happened, unfortunately. It got absorbed, it got buried. It was treated like something that would bring shame or vergüenza to the family if it ever came out. And not even shame on whoever caused the abuse or the harm, but shame on the family for having it happen at all. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's true. And so in that term, silence wasn't neglect. In a lot of the cases, it was the only response that anyone ever had been taught to have. And we can talk more about that, right? Like this idea of, people are going to think that you did something to deserve this, or even your family thought that you must have done something to deserve it, or we should have protected you better for it not to happen, so now the parenting is in question. So lots of reasons why there was shame surrounding sexual abuse, and I am not saying that any of it is valid or that it deserves shame, but I'm just mentioning that is one of the reasons why a lot of people have chosen and chose to stay silent. A second reason is machismo and the protection of men in the family, sometimes even at the expense of naming what men in the family had done. No se habla mal de la familia. You just don't accuse a tío, a padrino, a family friend, because doing that threatens the whole structure. And so it seems easier, it seems safer, and it seems less disruptive to restrict the child's access than to ever name why. And so, this idea of los hombres son así, and I fully realize that sexual abuse is not only committed by men, but in this instance, I'm talking about how machismo comes in, right? But this idea of así son los hombres, so you need to take care of yourself for things not to happen to you because that is to be expected of them. Or, you just sometimes have your information on rumors, and so you don't want to accuse a family member based on rumors. There's lots of reasons, right? But a lot of protection around men in the family, unfortunately. A third reason why people might stay silent is the lack of language around this. A lot of our moms and our grandmas didn't have the words either. Nobody sat them down and taught them how to talk about this. So they kind of built a wall around it instead. It just became rules like no sleepovers, pijamadas no, estar solo con tu tío. They protected through restriction because they'd never really been given the tools to protect through conversation. Right? And fourth, sometimes the silence wasn't just about protecting a reputation. Sometimes it was rooted in something that had already happened. So to her, your mom, your tía, your abuela, or to someone before her. And instead of that becoming a story she could tell you, it became a rule that she gave you. So sometimes it was based on experience, right? If she experienced abuse from someone close to her, then she might just have a lack of trust around anybody around close to you. So when we look back at the no hacemos pijamadas rule, or we don't do sleepovers, it wasn't just about the sleepover. It was shame. It was machismo. It was not having language. It was just statistics that no one ever knew, but kind of roughly knew about, or sometimes someone's own unspoken history. And it was a lot easier to say, no sleepovers. Uno nunca sabe. And as always, I don't want anything I say to sound like I'm criticizing our moms and our tias and our abuelas for protecting us the way that they did. I really do think most of them were working with what they had. But I do want to be honest. I do think it's worth naming honestly what silence protected against and what it cost us. So what it protected against is real. Restriction works in a narrow sense, right? If a child isn't left alone with someone, that closes off an opportunity. Rules can genuinely prevent harm, even unspoken ones. But here's the cost. And I want to walk through this in a few parts because I don't think it's just one thing. First, no language for their own bodies. Because the danger was never named, a lot of us grew up without vocabulary for our own boundaries, our own instincts, what was and wasn't okay. We knew no without knowing why, which means if something ever did feel wrong, we didn't always have the words to identify it or the permission to say something out loud. So danger was only ever pointed outward. The rule was aimed at other people's houses, other tios, other situations. Not there, not him, not that sleepover. It was rarely aimed inward at teaching us as children that our own body belongs to us, no matter who was asking, no matter where they were. So there's that. And again, all the responsibility landed on prevention, and specifically on the child and the family being careful enough. And that's a big one. The entire model was restrict, monitor, control access. And if you do that well enough, harm should not happen, right? Which quietly puts the whole weight of prevention on the potential victim and on the household around them instead of on the person who might cause harm, or on a broader sense that abusers are the ones responsible for abuse. We were never taught he is responsible if he does this. What got taught was you will be safe if we restrict enough and if you follow all the rules. But then when prevention fails, because no amount of restriction can cover every single scenario, then that framework leaves a child or a family feeling like it must have been their fault. They weren't careful enough, they broke a rule, instead of someone made a choice to cause harm, and that responsibility was never ever theirs to carry. And then if something did happen, disclosure was harder. Thinking about what a child would have had to do in a household built around silence and prevention to come forward, right? They'd have to break the rule that the whole family operated by, and they'd have to do it about someone that's already inside the family trust, which we know from the statistics is usually who does it. And that's an enormous ask for a child who's already scared and confused. Shame gets inherited even without an event. So even kids who were never harmed absorbed the shame around the topic. The silence itself was teaching a lesson that this is something so unspeakable, we don't even say the word. And it could isolate survivors specifically. If abuse did happen, a child living inside a family with no language for it was many times, or is often, left to carry it completely alone. Not because anyone chose that for them, of course not, but because the entire structure around them had just no way for them to come forward and be met with belief and support. So this is all the real cost of uno nunca sabe, right? As when it stands in for an actual conversation, an actual explanation. Again, not that the rule was wrong, because again, restriction genuinely can prevent harm. But a rule without language leaves a child able to follow instructions, but not being taught where responsibility actually belongs, and not being equipped to recognize risk beyond the boundaries, the rules, or without being able to come forward if the unthinkable already happened. All right, so let's bring this all back. We Don't Do Sleepovers was never really about sleepovers. It was protection, built the only way that our family knew how to build it, which was through restriction, through silence, through this uno nunca sabe, standing in for a conversation nobody had the words or the safety to have. And I hope by now it's clear this is not about placing blame on them. They were doing their best with what they'd survived and what they'd never been given the language to name. But we get to do something different now. Not instead of protection, but with it. We can keep the instinct to protect and add what was missing, which was actual language. So teaching kids that their bodies belong to them, no matter who's asking, teaching them that if something feels wrong, they can say so and that they will be believed, teaching them clearly that responsibility for abuse never belongs to them, never belongs to a child, but it belongs entirely to whoever chooses to cause harm. So that's the shift, not less protection, because we know that again works, but protection isn't only restriction. Protection also should include language. It should include trust and permission to speak and the assurance that they will be believed and they will be comforted and they will be supported. So this is generational work, same as everything that we talk about on the podcast. It's not about undoing what our family did, but building on it. For sure, keep the watchfulness, but also giving it words. There is so much more that can be said around sexual abuse, around the aftermath of it, around the shame of it. As always, I know that these episodes are short and in no way represent every nuance and everything that comes into it, but I think that it's important to name certain things and hopefully get a conversation going and get you thinking. But if this episode brought something up for you, something that you're carrying or that maybe you never shared with anyone, just know that you don't have to carry it alone. I encourage you to talk to a therapist, preferably someone who is trained to hold this with you. You don't have to have language for it right away. You just don't have to be the only one who knows. Again, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. We're slowly growing the podcast listeners, so I'm very, very excited for that. Y les quiero contar that I just got back from Guadalajara this past weekend. My colleague Claudia and I went to check it out to see if it's a possibility for a future retreat. And we went to Tlaquepaque, specifically in Jalisco, which is near Guadalajara. And we only had 2 full days and we made the best of it, trying to, get all our questions answered, check out locations, etc. And if all goes well, that might be our spring location for a retreat. I say all goes well because it's not just up to us. We want to have partnerships with people at the location who are responsive and who share our vision, because we don't want to invite people to come to these retreats and then have things be unorganized or, just not the way that we promote it. And so if you're interested in a possible retreat in Tlaquepaque, Jalisco in the spring, make sure you're signed up for my newsletter. If you go to my website, thechicanatherapist.com, and sign up for my newsletter, that will be one of the first places, if not the first place, that we will announce dates and details around it. And as always, I am on Facebook, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram as the Chicana Therapist. So follow me on those platforms if you haven't already. As always, I'm open to feedback or requests for specific topics. Feel free to email me at info@thechicanatherapist.com. And as always, I'll see you next time. Cuídense mucho. Thank you for listening. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast constitutes therapy, clinical advice, or a therapeutic relationship. Listening to this podcast does not establish a provider-client relationship, and if you're experiencing a mental health crisis or in need of clinical support, please contact a licensed mental health professional or call or text 988 Crisis Hotline.